Greetings, online students. I'm going to be taping the diabetes section, and I'm so excited because this is one of my favorite topics. If you haven't taken care of a diabetic, chances are you will, or some type of complication related to their diabetes. And it's in all areas. You'll see it in OB, you'll see it in peds, you'll see it in psych, and you'll see it in med-surg. So regardless, home health, whatever you pick, school nursing, the diabetes, the chances of coming into contact with a diabetic patient is guaranteed. So what I'm going to do is divide this into three parts. Part 1 is short and sweet. Part 2 is pretty neat. And part 3, we'll see. Let it be. Alrighty then. If you haven't done read your objectives, you will need to read your objectives because that's where you will find all your reading assignments. So without further ado, let's get started. I have posted the PowerPoint with and without your notes so that you will be able to do whichever way that you prefer. So again, diabetes has become rather rampant. When we're looking at our reading assignments, 2 chapters mainly from the med-surg book. Chapter 61 is an overview of all the endocrine system and assessment. And then chapter 64 focuses actually on diabetes. Your PEDS books, chapter 29, pages 992 through 1006. Just some helpful hints. Theorist anyone? And that didn't say no one, that says anyone. So yes, we will be doing theorist. Pharmacology for sure. Delegation and lots of it. Select all that apply. Levels of prevention, always. Primary, secondary, and tertiary. And Tanner's, oh yes. So if you need any of these posted, if you've lost any of your Tanners or your theorists, just let me know and I'll get that for you. Alright, so let's talk about the A&P of the pancreas. The endocrine system we know is composed of glands or granular cells, and they do what I call the 3 S's. Either they synthesize, they store, or they secrete chemical messengers known as hormones. And these go throughout the blood system and target particular cells throughout the body. Now, if you'll remember back in A&P, the pancreas is rather small, but boy, is it a loaded organ that can do all kinds of stuff. It lies behind the stomach, and it is anterior to L1 and L2. It's about 6 inches long, and it's about 1 to 2 inches wide. So it's not very long, and it's not very wide, but boy, does it do a lot of things. It only weighs about 60 to 90 grams, and it has both exocrine and endocrine functions. And I'll talk about the main difference in that on the next slide. Now, insulin secretion begins very early in utero, 20 weeks of gestation. So even a fetus can have issues with the endocrine system, and they can be born that way in the neonatal period. So there are 2 types of functions of the pancreas. The first is exocrine, and the big thing with exocrine is that you have to have a duct. For example, I've got pancreatic enzymes that are secreted via duct into the duodenum or duodenum, whichever one you prefer to call it. And when you compare that to the endocrine system, it's a gland that secretes substance directly into the blood. For example, the beta cells secrete insulin directly into the bloodstream. They don't go through a duct. So with that in mind, I ask you, what is the main difference then between endocrine and exocrine function? And you should have been thinking one has a duct and one is ductless. And that is correct. Ductless system is endocrine function. Exocrine function, you have to have a duct. Now, we are mainly going to be focusing on endocrine problems, okay? And when can these occur? At any age, including fetal and neonatal periods. Remember I said it's loaded with all kinds of functions. If you look on page 1260 in your book, it shows you the actual pancreas, and then it divides that down and actually shows you what the alpha cells, the beta cells, and the delta cells would look like within the islets of the pancreas. So let's take a look here. There are 3 distinct cells types that you're going to have to know. One is alpha, and these secrete glucagon. And I'm going to be going through a lot of G words, so make sure you get these straight in your head. Alpha cells secrete glucagon. Beta cells secrete insulin. Beta cells secrete insulin. And finally, D, delta cells secrete somatostatin. And we think that helps also kind of go between hypo and hyperglycemia that the alpha and beta cells can induce. Now, we start life with about 1 million islet cells, and then because of our lifestyle choices that we choose, those cells start dying off. So let's look at the functions of glucagon, okay? Glucagon is what we call a counter-regulatory hormone. A counter-regulatory hormone, and there are other counter-regulatory hormones in the body as well. They are epinephrine, norepinephrine, growth hormone, and cortisol. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, growth hormone, and cortisol, all of these, including glucagon, are counter-regulatory hormones. That means their actions are opposite those of insulin, and releases glucose in the form of glycogen. Okay, we got glucose, glucagon, and glycogen. And it releases glycogen from cell storage cells whenever blood glucose levels are low. So whenever your level's low, glucagon kicks in. Whenever your levels are high, insulin kicks in. So what does glucagon do? Glucagon goes to the storage cells, particularly liver and muscle fat cells. And what it does is it goes to that cell and says, hey, I know you have stored form of glucose in the form of glycogen. I need to convert that glycogen back to glucose, and I need you to release it back to us because we have a low glucose level going on. Now, there are other G words. There is gluconeogenesis and glyconeolysis. Gluconeogenesis is the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, such as fats and proteins. Now, this is what we would use long-term needs, if we had long-term needs of keeping the body going. Glyconeogenesis is the release and conversion of stored glycogen into glucose from the liver and muscle cells, and this is our short-term needs, okay? This is our short-term needs. And I apologize, I think I said fat cells earlier, and it would be muscle cells is where glycogen is stored. So our body, if we get into trouble, starts first with short-term needs until it depletes all the glycogen that's been stored and converted back into glucose. Then it goes into gluconeogenesis, which is our long-term needs. When would glucagon be released? When would glucagon be released? Well, if you think about when glucagon would be released, it would be released anytime that we need to protect the body from hypoglycemia. So anytime we need to protect the body from hypoglycemia, it will be released. So don't forget, glucagon, epi, norepinephrine, growth hormone, and cortisol are all counter-regulatory hormones. So let's look at this in this format for you visual folks. Glucagon is the hormones whose action is to increase blood sugar levels, right? Remember that? Glucagon, it has short-term and long-term route that it can go. The first thing that it's going to do is the short-term route needs, and that is in the form of glyconeogenesis. And what it's going to do in glycogenolysis is stimulate the release and conversion of glycogen, which is the stored form of glucose in the liver and muscle cells, into glucose back into the bloodstream. Well, what's that going to do? Increase the blood sugar level. And it's going to do that till it depletes the stores. Then it's going to go here to long-term needs, and gluconeogenesis is going to occur, and the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources such as fats and proteins going to kick in. And this is where we get into trouble because we start throwing off ketones and acids and amino acids, and we end up throwing someone into diabetic ketoacidosis if we're not careful, because it increases the blood sugar quite high as well. Alrighty then, so that is how we can get our short-term and our long-term needs met. If you have any questions about that, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. Now let's look at the functions of insulin. We know it increases the uptake and use of glucose. That we pretty much know. It takes glucose, stores it until we need it in the form of glycogen. But it also is a regulator of carbs, fats, and proteins. It facilitates glucose across cell membranes. And it's the only hormone that directly lowers glucose level. One of the big things you're going to want to remember about it is that this right here, it augments the transport of potassium into cells. It augments the transport of potassium into cells. So when you got insulin on board, potassium's going into cells. Keep that in mind because we'll be talking about that later on. It also stimulates protein synthesis, and it has a basal rate. That means it's continually releasing into the bloodstream in small pulsative increments. Now, what are you calling small pulsative increments? About every 10 minutes. About every 10 minutes, your pancreas is zip, zip, with the insulin, trying to keep that level normal. Then I ask you two questions. Number one, what happens after a meal is eaten? What happens after a meal is eaten? Well, if you look over here, it says insulin secretion increases. Doesn't that make sense? You've taken in a bunch of carbs. You've got to get that level down. So how does it do that? It moves glucose from the blood into your muscle and your liver and some of your fat cells in the form of glycogen, so that blood sugar levels decrease and facilitate a stable, normal range for your glucose. So that's what happens after a meal. So then my second question would be, what happens between meals and overnight? How do we stay normal? And between meals and overnight, we've got the buddy system. Insulin and glucagon work together to maintain that constant level of a normal glucose level. Just an FYI, the average amount of insulin secreted daily by an adult is about 50 units, or 0.5 units per kilogram of body weight. So if you're obese, then you are secreting more insulin, and that's what starts building this insulin resistance that type 2 insulins get. So when insulin makes the blood sugar drop, usually in the 80s, then glucagon kicks in just to make sure it kind of stays there. When blood sugars get down in the 60s, glucagon kicks in to increase it to get it back up into the 80s. So you try to keep that balance during the nighttime in between meals. And your body works together to do that through the buddy system. So what effect does insulin have on the central nervous system? Well, the central nervous system, we know, is permeable to glucose. In other words, it doesn't need insulin to transport it into a cell. Hyperglycemia does not damage brain cells, but cells cannot survive with a glucose deficiency. What's the importance of that statement I just made? The importance is hypoglycemia is always more dangerous than hyperglycemia because of the potential of permanently damaging brain cells. The central nervous system stores only a minimal amount of glycogen, so there's not much to fall back on there. So with that in mind, what I just said, which one of these following clients would you see first? Mr. Smith, blood sugar of 50. Mr. Jones, blood sugar of 80. Mr. Tom, blood sugar of 160, or Mr. Carter, blood sugar of 300. And the one you should have chosen is Mr. Smith, blood sugar of 50, because of this right here. Cells cannot survive with a glucose deficiency and can relate in permanent brain damage. So what's the function of somatostatin, the delta cells? Again, we think it bounces back and forth between hypo and hyperglycemia, trying to regulate the degree of insulin and glucagon that's released. And that's the big thing. Some think it helps keep that postprandial blood sugar down. Postprandial means after a meal, and usually 2 hours after a meal, postprandial, your sugar should be back to normal. Alrighty then, that was the short and sweet part. Assessment is not much longer. When we're getting ready to do assessment, we want to make sure that we're doing a good history. And a good history involves good subjective data. And we're going to be getting the biographical data. We want to know about their age, their height, their weight, their gender. We want to know what brought them in, what was their chief complaint, if they had changes in weight, thirst, urination. Do they have a family history? What medications are they on? What is their lifestyle stressors? What is their coping patterns? Do they have support systems? What is their lifestyle habits and beliefs and value patterns? And we'll talk about how all of this affects a diabetic. Hormones affect every body tissue, and they cause diversity in the signs and symptoms, particularly of the endocrine dysfunction. So your assessment skills of the endocrine system are often require you to have very keen clinical skills so that you can detect manifestations of these disorders that we're going to be talking about. Now, some common medications that you may not be aware of that affect glucose levels. We have some glucose common lowering meds, which are Tylenol, ding, 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 beta blockers, which almost everybody's on, insulin, of course, and your tricyclic antidepressants. These are all very common meds, and a lot of people do not know that they actually cause glucose lowering. Some of your glucose raising meds would be caffeine, barbiturates, birth control pills, glucocorticosteroids, Lasix, lithium, and we know epi because epi and cortisol are two of our what? Counter-regulatory hormones, so we know that they raise the sugar. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind, just kind of an FYI. All right, good history. Objective data. You're going to have to do a good physical exam. You're primarily going to be doing inspection and palpation. You're going to be doing a good inspection head to toe on a diabetic. You are particularly looking at their skin, their feet, and their eyes. All diabetics should have a good diabetic eye exam yearly. All diabetics should be having someone look at their feet. All diabetics should have a good skin exam. Palpation, you're going to be palpating for nodules. And percussion and auscultation, of course, are not normally part of the endocrine system because we can't do that to the endocrine organs. So that's the end of part 1 that covers the A&P and assessment. If you have any questions or concerns, speak now or forever hold your peace. Not really. I just seen if you're reading, daydreaming, texting, catnapping. Okay, here we go. Back to focus. All right, the big thing before we get started on part 2 and part 3, and again, part 2, I'm going to be doing a Blackboard Collaborate live session, and those of you who do not get to attend can watch the recording. And then part 3, I will actually do the YouTube on as well. So what about type 1 versus type 2? This is very important that you know the difference, and I've set up a little chart here, so you want to make sure you know this. Type 1 versus type 2. Well, what about age? Well, usually type 1 is those under 30, with the peak age 10 to 15, with the peak age being 10 to 15. Usually type 2 is over 30, with the peak age actually being in your 50s. The signs and symptoms are going to come on very abruptly with type 1. Where with type 2, they sneak on you, very insidious. They come up very slowly and quietly, and all of a sudden you've got type 2. Type 1, HLA typing is very important, and we'll talk about this. Certain types of HLAs make you more prone to get type 1, particularly in the presence of certain viruses. With type 2, there's no relation to having certain HLA types. With this type, islet cells antibodies are positive. Autoantibodies are positive, which means an autoimmunity. For some reason, the body turned upon itself and destroyed the islet cells in the pancreas. Therefore, they no longer render insulin, and they particularly like the beta cells. With this one, the islet cells are negative, so it does not involve autoimmunity with type 2. With type 1, there's no insulin. With type 2, there may be some insulin. That's very significant to know. With type 1, they're usually thin in appearance. Type 2, obese. In fact, obesity is the major risk factor. With type 1, you have your 3 Ps, and we'll talk about those, the polyuria, the polydipsia, polyphagia, and fatigue. And with type 2, it's mainly fatigue with other signs and symptoms. You may have the 3 Ps, but not as pronounced as you will with type 1. With type 1, they're always going to be prone to ketosis because they have no insulin. Therefore, they have to go to those long-term needs, and they break down ketones. With this one, they do have some insulin, so they are resistant to ketosis. They do not end up in DKA with type 2, just type 1 because of this. Very rarely will you ever see a type 2 in DKA, but it can occur. Control with insulin, diet, and exercise, and with this one, it's exercise meds, and unfortunately, some of your type 2s are now on insulin. With type 1, it affects males and females equally, but with type 2s, females, we are seeing a larger population than the males, and obesity is the major risk factor. All right, so let's look at type 1 diabetic. And this is a little visual for those of you who like visuals. The 3 Ps. They're going to have polyuria, increase urination, polydipsia, increase thirst, and polyphagia, increase hunger. Because of that, they're going to have weight loss, fatigue. They may have increased frequency of infections because of the increased urination, particularly glucose going through there. Rapid onset occurs abruptly. They will be insulin dependent, familial tendency in that the HLAs, because of the HLAs, and then peak incidence is 10 to 15 years. So you see this woman and she's got her 3 Ps. She's coming out of the bathroom, she's got her to-go McDonald's, and she's drinking on her way out. So she's got her 3 Ps. All righty. With type 2 diabetes, they have a sedentary lifestyle. Now with this one, familial tendency is it is hereditary. Type 1 is not hereditary. It's autoimmunity because of the fact of virus. You have certain HLAs. But type 2 diabetes runs in families. The average age is 50. It will result usually from you'll end up with a history of hypertension, fatigue, decreased energy, obesity, recurrent infections. Again, you may have your polyuria, polydipsia, and you have a constant fasting blood sugar running a greater than 126. Okay. As far as delegation on the exam, just a few tips. The CNA can reinforce education and teaching, but not initiate it. Stick to the basic skills a CNA can perform when you're answering the questions. An LPN can reinforce teaching, discharge teaching, observation skills, not assessment skills. IV meds, not in every state, so don't always assume that they can do IV meds because in a lot of states they cannot. So stick to the basic skills when you think about an LPN. Medications, dressing changes, things like that. Alrighty then, I'm very excited. That concludes part 1. If you have any questions, then please give me a holler. Thank you very much and have a great day.